Okay, this video is on King Henry IV, Part 2. Again, the title here, the title of the play is as it is indexed in the 1623 folio. The quartos is just Henry IV, Part 2. Obviously, a sequel to Henry IV, Part 1, continuing the development of Henry, Prince of Wales, Prince Harry, who, if you'll recall, emerged at the end of Part 1 as a chivalrous knight, competent in battle. He defeats Hotspur, but now has to prove himself ready and able to earn the trust of his subjects and rule as king, which is his trajectory in this play. Here is the title page for the 1600 quarto. If you want to see how this play fits in with Shakespeare's, with his other histories, both in terms of the historical narrative and in the context of the published artifacts, the other quartos of the histories, I would urge you to go back to the video on the first part of Henry IV, where I talk more about it there. So Andrew Wise and William Aspley called on their regular printer, Valentine Sims, to print the quarto of Henry IV, Part 2. The title page, like that of Part 1, calls attention to both the play's historical and comic subject matter. So on the one hand, it gives an account of the death of Henry IV and the accession of his son, Prince Harry, Hal. And on the other hand, it includes comic material of entirely Shakespearean invention, represented by the popular characters Falstaff and Pistol. By this time, by 1600, the year that this quarto was published, it was normal and profitable for Shakespeare to be credited as the author of his printed plays. So his name does appear on this title page, as it did not in the first quarto of Henry, the first part of Henry IV. So while there's only one quarto edition of Part 2, it was later reissued with one really significant change, and that was the addition of Act 3, Scene 1. This scene includes Henry's lengthy commentary and really fantastic speech, actually, on the deposition of Richard II. There are several possible explanations for this omission from the first issue of the quarto, ranging from just simple printing house oversight to government censorship. The most intriguing theory that I've encountered is that the scene was deliberately removed, either by the publishers or by Shakespeare himself, perhaps, because of the failed Essex Rebellion and the suspicion that fell on the Lord Chamberlain's men, who had been commissioned to perform Richard II for the conspirators on the eve of the planned coup. So the scene may have been reinstated after Shakespeare's company was cleared of any involvement in that rebellion. So that's really interesting. We're going to look at Act 3, Scene 1 later in this video. The mystery of Act 3, Scene 1 may be related to several other long passages, totaling quite a few lines, 168 lines, that did not appear in print until the 1623 folio. Most of these passages address the theme of rebellion, indicating their early omission may have been intentional. We don't know for sure, because most modern editions of Henry IV, Part 2 are based on the 1600 quarto text rather than the folio. These passages, all 168 lines, are absent from the print edition of the Norton Shakespeare, from most modern scholarly editions of this play, actually. So I'm not going to put all of them up on screen here, but I think some of them are really intriguing. This one, the 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 dog vomit dog vomit passage. This would have come after Act 1, Scene 3, line 61. If you're curious to see where it would fit in our edition of Shakespeare. The speech is 24 lines, and I chose this one because it echoes what Rumor, the personification Rumor in the prologue to the play, the induction, contemptuously says of the wavering multitude. So I'll just read this. This is Archbishop Scroop speaking here. He says, "The commonwealth is sick of their own choice. Their over-greedy love hath surfeited. An habitation giddy and unsure hath he that buildeth on the vulgar heart. O thou fond many, with what loud applause didst thou beat heaven with blessing Bolingbroke before he was what thou wouldst have him be? And being now trimmed in thine own desires, thou, beastly feeder, art so full of him that thou provokest thyself to cast him up. So, thou common dog, didst thou disgorge thy glutton bosom of the royal Richard, and now thou wouldst eat thy dead vomit up, and howlst to find it. What is in these times? They that when Richard lived would have him die, are now become enamored on his grave. Thou that threwst dust upon his goodly head, when through proud London he came sighing on after the admired heels of Bolingbroke, criest now, O earth, yield us that king again." And then I've got one more speech, part of it anyway, a little shorter. This is after Act 2, Scene 3, line 22. It's a longish speech, 23 lines. This is Kate Percy speaking, Hotspur's widow now, who rebukes Northumberland here, her father-in-law, for gearing up to go to war to back up the Archbishop and Mowbray. And this speech may have seemed to contain too much admiration for the rebellious Hotspur. Maybe the desire for regime change expressed here was, or that's conveyed here, was a little too warmly expressed, perhaps. She says, "He, that is Hotspur, was the mark and glass, copy and book that fashioned others. And him, O wondrous, him, O miracle of men, him did you leave, second to none, unseconded by you, to look upon the hideous god of war and disadvantage, to abide a field where nothing but the sound of Hotspur's name did seem defensible. So you left him. Never, oh, never do his ghost the wrong, to hold your honor more precise and nice with others than with him. Let them alone. The Marshal," and she means Lord Mowbray there, "and the Archbishop are strong. Had my sweet Harry had but half their numbers, today might I, hanging on Hotspur's neck, have talked of Monmouth," that's Prince Harry's grave. So we'll identify some of the characters here. Some of them will be familiar from the previous play, King Henry IV, Prince Harry, Hal, who becomes king in the final act of this play. His younger brother, Lord John of Lancaster. And then a new character here, the character that didn't appear in the previous play, the Lord Chief Justice, has a very important role in several scenes in this play. They have a new set of enemies mentioned in the first part of Henry IV. Archbishop Scroop in particular, who is now supported by Lord Hastings, Lord Mowbray, and some others. I'm not going to list them here, but these are the two major figures backing up the Archbishop in the play. And then, of course, we have the Eastcheap group, Falstaff, of course, whom we'll be talking a lot about, Harry's friend Poins or Ned, and then some new figures, Pistol, Mistress Quickly is back. She has a much bigger part in this play than in the first one, the first part. And then the prostitute doll tear sheet. So just to help with study, we'll go through a summary of all 5 acts of the play, as I usually do in these videos, starting with Act 1, of course, 3 scenes. So after the Battle of Shrewsbury, which is how Part 1 of Henry IV ended, the Earl of Northumberland receives conflicting accounts of the outcome of the battle. Morton finally delivers the bad news that the rebels were routed and Northumberland's son Hotspur slain, and that the Earl of Westmoreland and John of Lancaster are marching toward York. Meanwhile, in the streets of London, Falstaff suffers physical complaints. He's suffering from gout and venereal disease, and he fulminates against the perceived snubs of Prince Hal and a merchant named Master Smooth, who refuses to extend him credit. He is confronted by the Lord Chief Justice, who reminds him of outstanding charges against him for the Gad's Hill robbery. That was an episode in the first part of King Henry IV. But Falstaff's service at Shrewsbury has earned him a reprieve. But the Chief Justice warns him, you need to stay out of trouble. Don't make me come at you again. And Falstaff has been ordered to join forces with Lancaster and Westmoreland, but clearly would prefer not to fight. He wasn't really eager to fight at Shrewsbury either. To the north, Northumberland's allies strategize a response to Lancaster and Westmoreland's advance. Hastings is concerned that their combined forces will be inadequate, but is reminded that the king's army is spread across multiple fronts, Wales and France, and therefore not as strong and vulnerable. So Act 2 opens in Eastcheap, and Fang and Snare have come to arrest Falstaff for debts owed to Mistress Quickly. A fight ensues, but is interrupted by the arrival of the Chief Justice. He appears again and advises Falstaff to pay up and repent of his false dealings with Mistress Quickly. The scene takes a sudden turn when news arrives of the king's illness and withdrawal from Wales. And faced with his father's mortality, meanwhile, Prince Hal begins to regret his choice of friends and repent his past delinquency. So he's taking his first steps towards maturing into king here. A malicious letter, however, arrives from Falstaff accusing Hal's friend Poins of spreading a rumor that the prince intends to marry Poins' sister, Nell. So this prompts Hal and Poins to develop this plan to disguise themselves as drink servers and spy on Falstaff at a tavern and get him into some kind of trouble. And Falstaff's there supping with Mistress Quickly and the prostitute doll Tearsheet. At Warkworth, Northumberland prepares himself for battle, but his wife and Hotspur's widow Kate remind him of his son's fate at Shrewsbury and persuade him to withdraw to Scotland and wait for a more propitious moment to join the battle. Back in Eastcheap, Falstaff banters with Tearsheet. His ensign Pistol, real troublemaker, arrives looking for sexual gratification, but is spurned by the women, and this causes a brawl to break out, and Pistol gets bounced from the tavern, and Tearsheet fawns over Falstaff, and shortly after, Hal and Poins arrive. Remember, they're disguised, and overhear Falstaff's insults against them. When Hal and Poins are revealed, Falstaff avers that his harsh remarks were meant to protect them from the vices of his Eastcheap associates, which of course is completely bunk, and they realize that. Word arrives that trouble is afoot in the north, and both Hal and Falstaff must leave. And we'll take a closer look at that scene a little later And then Act 2 closes with Falstaff getting a last quickie with Tearsheet. So here's a picture illustrating scene 3 in 19th century painting. This shows Falstaff surveying the men who've basically been conscripted into his army, Shadow and Wart and the rest of that group. A very funny scene. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that scene, but it's absolutely hilarious. I love it. So, unable to sleep, the king summons Warwick and Surrey to discuss the imminent confrontation with the forces of Archbishop Scrope and Northumberland. And Gloucestershire, Justice Silence patiently listens as Justice Shallow rambles on about his lusty school days and dead acquaintances and reminisces about his adventures with young Falstaff. The reason we're here in Gloucestershire is that Falstaff arrives. They have recruited some men for him, and they are a raggedy crew, I tell you, to join his army. The most able-bodied of this group, they immediately bribe their way out of service, which also happens in part 1 of Henry IV, leaving Falstaff with Wart, Shadow, and Feeble. Irritated by Shallow's smugness and exaggerated account of his wild-spent youth, Falstaff plans to return to Gloucestershire after the war and take advantage of his old, naive acquaintance. Here's a scene from Act 4. This is the I'll talk about this scene at length later in this video. Crucial moment in the play, the crown robbing scene there. And Prince Hal reaching for his father's crown as his father lies dying in bed. So in York, Archbishop Scrope, Hastings, and Mowbray discuss the political and military implications of Northumberland's retreat to Scotland. Westmoreland arrives, as he's basically an ambassador for the king here, and brokers a peace between the rebels and Lancaster, Henry IV's son. After initially consenting to the rebels' terms of peace, the Duke waits for their troops to disperse and then orders the Archbishop, Hastings, and Mowbray arrested and sentenced to death. Falstaff arrives late, but captures one of the rebels, Colville of the Dale, and expects his valor to be acknowledged with royal favors. He makes that very clear. After a long speech on the virtues of sack, his favorite drink, he departs for Gloucestershire. The ailing king, meanwhile, looks forward to a long-delayed crusade to the Holy Land, and something he talked about even in the first part of Henry IV. Reports come in that the Archbishop and his supporters have been taken, and that further north, Northumberland has likewise been defeated by the king's Scottish allies. Henry advises his younger sons, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Thomas, Duke of Clarence, on how to deal with their older brother when he accedes to the throne. Concerned that the prince is still associating himself with Poins and the rest of the East Cheap rogues, he predicts England will descend into lawless barbarism. Approaching death now, he's taken to bed, where he's visited by Harry, who takes the crown and places it on his own head. A fascinating scene. The king awakens and rebukes the prince, who explains himself and reassures his father. And then after their reconciliation, Henry advises his son one last time before passing away. And here is an image of Henry Monmouth this time, now King Henry V, rebuking Falstaff, who is going to be banished from the city of London. Very controversial scene. So Falstaff calls on Justice Shallow in Gloucestershire, as he promised he would do, and observes in Shallow's interactions with Davy how men naturally conform to the values and manners of their companions, from which he concludes that he must get back to London and continue to entertain and influence Prince Hal. In the wake of Henry IV's death, the Chief Justice expects retribution for a prior incident that resulted in Hal's arrest and imprisonment. We'll take a look at this later. Instead, however, Harry expresses his understanding and appreciation of the Chief Justice's service during his father's reign and wishes him to continue in that role under his own reign. Meanwhile, Falstaff and company are carousing in Shallow's orchard when Pistol arrives with the announcement that Prince Hal is now effectively King Henry V. He's just awaiting his coronation at this point. Falstaff regards this news favorably and begins doling out princely titles to his companions. This is great news, he thinks. Now he'll be able to live his life of crime with impunity. Mistress Quickly and Doll Tearsheet belie that assumption because they're arrested in London, whipped, and imprisoned. Falstaff arrives in London shortly after, eager to greet the newly crowned Hal, who's now Henry V, but is spurned and banished from London. In the very end, Prince John anticipates military action in France, which will happen in the sequel to this play, King Henry V. This is the image you see here. This is a detail from a very famous portrait of Queen Elizabeth, the rainbow portrait, it's called. You can't see the rainbow clearly here. But this painting was recently restored and is in, I can't remember the residence it's in. One of the royal residences in England, but it toured the United States after its restoration. And her outfit here, the Queen's, this is the most terrifying piece of royal wardrobe I've ever seen in a British Renaissance portrait. These eyes and ears, which clearly symbolize the power, sort of the all-seeing, all-hearing power of the stage. It's just what an intimidating image this is. So Henry IV, Part 2, opens with an induction or a prologue addressed to Shakespeare's audience by the personification of rumor, who delights in spreading misinformation and sowing discord. In Henry V, Part 1, the warring factions benefited from prompt, reliable intelligence. Both sides employed a network of agents and messengers to keep one step ahead of their opposition. For an example of this, in Act 3, Scene 2, Blunt rushes to inform the king that the Percy coalition has been scouted at Shrewsbury, only to learn after telling him this, that the king had already been informed of their movements 5 days earlier and has already sent Westmoreland and John of Lancaster to cut off any further advance. It's kind of funny, because Blunt's, hurrying to tell him this, and he's like, yeah, I know all about it. I've already got it. It's under control now. But clearly Shakespeare sought a different atmosphere for this play, where leaders are frequently bewildered by rumors, false reports. The first act of the play opens with Northumberland receiving conflicting reports of the outcome of the Battle of Shrewsbury, and you can contrast this with the opening scene of Part 1 of Henry IV, where the king receives pretty reliable intelligence from Westmoreland and Blunt. In Act 4, Scene 3 of this play, the king himself receives conflicting reports from his younger sons on the whereabouts of Prince Harry, who is not hunting at Windsor, as initially reported, but carousing with Poins in Eastcheap. So language plays a more central role in the major events of this play as well. The rebels, for example, are ultimately conquered not by military force, but by the cunning use of language, what rumor might call covert enmity under the smile of safety. And proofs of Prince Hal's competence as successor to his late father come not on the battlefield, but rather in important speeches like his reconciliation with the Lord Chief Justice and his rebuke of Falstaff in the final scene of the play. And we'll be taking a look at all of these scenes later in the video. The induction also states that rumor is like a pipe, that is a musical instrument, being of so easy and plain a stop that the blunt monster with uncounted heads, the still discordant, wavering multitude, can play upon it. In this passage, in these lines I just quoted, Shakespeare acknowledges the threat of language, its power to undermine social order and destabilize regimes of power. The image here of the mythical Hydra, the blunt monster with uncounted heads, is evoked later in the play by the Archbishop as a metaphor for war. He says, "The time misorder doth in common sense crowd us and crush us to this monstrous form, this Hydra son of war." And the image of the Hydra also figures in the Battle of Shrewsbury, the first part of Henry IV, where I think it's Douglas who says there are so many King Henry IVs running around. It's like a Hydra. Every time I kill one of the King Henrys, another one pops up. But the point here is that language can jeopardize the state, which is significant and ominous. But linguistic order is also the source of much of the comedy of the play. So we have the stately verse of the nobility on the one hand, iambic pentameter, and this is countered by the flagrant, irregular prose of the commoners, which can be at times scintillating, but nearly as often is utterly nonsensical. Among the Henriade plays, the second part of Henry IV contains the highest concentration of prose, 52%. In fact, this is the first of Shakespeare's plays in which prose, the number of prose lines outnumbers the verse lines. King Richard II, by contrast, the first play in the Henriade, doesn't contain any prose at all. So in this play, there's the witty wordplay of Falstaff as he interviews his recruits, Moldy, Shadow, and that group in Act 3, Scene 2. There's Mistress Quickly's quirky malaprops, like my favorites are Honeyseed and Honeysuckle for homicide and homicidal. That's in Act 2, Scene 1. There's also Justice Shallow's drunken redundancies in Act 5, Scene 3. And, of course, more famously, Pistol's bombastic rhetoric. And I give you an example of it here, one of the more famous examples. "I'll see her," and he's talking about Doll Tearsheet here, "I'll see her damned first, to Pluto's damned lake by this hand, to the infernal deep, with Erebus and tortures vile also. Hold hook and line, say I. Down, down, dogs, down, faders. Have we not her in here?" It is no coincidence, then, given all of this prose from various commoners. It's no coincidence that this play, Henry IV, Part 2, was one of the most heavily censored plays in the folio, with many of the profanities that we see in the text in the first quarter omitted from the folio in 1623 due to the 1606 Act to Restrain the Abuses of Players, which I have talked about elsewhere. So the first group of scenes we're going to look at, three of them, have to do with the ongoing rebellion against King Henry IV that started with the Percys and continues in this play. We are, basically right after the Battle of Shrewsbury here, and it's almost continuous. This play is with the final act of the first part of Henry IV. Although Shakespeare does quite a bit of historical compression in these plays, as he often does. The first scene we're going to look at, Scene 1, lines 60 to 160. Morton reporting Hotspur's death and Northumberland vowing his revenge. There's really some very nice poetry in these speeches, particularly in Northumberland's speech. These speeches draw a really stark contrast in the play with the comic prose of Falstaff. and the rest of the Eastcheap group. You'll notice in these speeches Northumberland's allusion to Homer's Iliad, for example, in lines 70 to 75, which endows with a kind of epic solemnity his grief over the death of his son Hotspur, his desire for the total annihilation of the Lancastrian regime is apocalyptic and has some interesting sort of meta-theater wordplay embedded in it as well. But it's a speech. It's a startling speech. It frightens even Northumberland's own supporters. He says, "Let order die, and let this world no longer be a stage to feed contention in a lingering act. But let one spirit of the firstborn Cain reign in all bosoms, that each heart being set on bloody courses, the rude scene may end, and darkness be the barrier of the dead." Wow, that is pretty apocalyptic. The next group of lines I want you to take a close look at is Act 3, Scene 1, the first 92 lines of that scene. And again, this is a scene that was absent from the first issue of the quarto and then later reinstated. And this is where the king reflects on power, time, and fate. He starts talking about how power is a burden that robs monarchs of sleep. And my favorite part of this speech is where he compares himself, sleepless in the quiet comforts of his palace, Westminster, to the ship boy who somehow sleeps perched high in the crow's nest of a ship that's being tossed on the open sea. It's just great lines. I'm going to read them. I think they're so great. "Wilt thou upon the high and giddy mast seal up the ship boy's eyes, and rock his brains in cradle of the rude imperious surge, and in the visitation of the winds, who take the ruffian billows by the top, curling their monstrous heads and hanging them with deafening clamor in the slippery clouds, that with the hurly death itself awakes? Canst thou, O partial sleep, give them repose to the wet sea sun in an hour so rude, and in the calmest and most stillest night, with all appliances and means to boot, deny it to a king? Then happy low lie down, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." Following this, Henry and the Earl of Warwick discuss the present state of the kingdom, which of course is embroiled in civil war. And it's these passages that may have been the reason that this scene was excluded from the first quarto, if one accepts that hypothesis. Henry here recounts again how he came to the throne, and this is a story that we've been told before in the first part of Henry IV. But what really stands out to me this time are his remarks about fate and change, lines 45 through 56 in particular, and also what he says a little later about prophecy. It is Richard II's prediction that Henry's political alliances would one day betray him and throw the country into civil war, which Warwick explains to Henry is not clairvoyance. It's not like Richard II had the power of second sight, but he was rather simply learning and applying the lessons of history. And this is what Warwick says: "This is a history in all men's lives, figuring the natures of the times deceased. The which observed, as many may prophesy with a near aim of the main chance of things as yet not come to life, who in their seeds and weak beginning lie entreasured. Such things become the hatch and brood of time. And by the necessary form of this, King Richard might create a perfect guess that great Northumberland, then false to him, would of that seed grow to a greater falseness, which should not find a ground to root upon unless on you." So Act 4, Scene 1, lines 168 to 290. This is where the rebels, Archbishop Scroop and the others, Hastings and Mowbray, are duped into a capitulation, and then they're arrested and executed. So Prince John, the Duke of Lancaster, is the king's representative here. During the peace negotiations, Hastings predicts the Wars of the Roses, which is one of the things I find important about this scene. He predicts the Wars of the Roses, and that would be the wars that would be fought a generation later, fought between the houses of York and Lancaster. And these wars are the subject of the sequel tetralogy, Henry VI, in 3 parts, and then King Richard III. And this anticipation of the Wars of the Roses can be found in lines 211 to 216. As I said earlier, what stands out to me about this scene is how Henry's forces defeat the rebels not through acts of military valor or chivalric honor, which is the language still preferred by the Archbishop and Mowbray in these scenes, but rather through deceptive diplomacy. And when the rebels realize they've been completely duped, Mowbray asks, "Is this proceeding just and honorable?" So again, he's using the vocabulary of chivalry. I'll let you all read Lancaster's response to that question: "Is this proceeding just and honorable?" and draw your own conclusions about it. So in these scenes, we look at a few scenes here that focus more on Prince Hal, Prince Harry's character. In Act 4, Scene 3, lines 20 through 80, King Henry assesses his son's character and his continued association with the Eastcheap crowd. And what I find most important is actually what Warwick says in response. So in this scene, Henry is talking about Hal with his younger brothers, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Thomas, Duke of Clarence. And it's Clarence who informs the king that Hal is not engaged in the royal activity of hunting at Windsor, but he's slumming with Poins in Eastcheap. The king is, of course, dismayed to hear this, but it's not unexpected entirely. From his perspective, from Henry's perspective, a king's subjects are a reflection of the king's character. So he sees his son's riotous public behavior and low-life company as a security threat. He says, "For when his headstrong riot hath no curb, when rage and hot blood are his counselors, when means and lavish manners meet together, oh, with what wings shall his affections fly towards fronting peril and opposed decay." More interesting than this, however, I think much closer to the truth, as we learn later in the play, is Warwick's very different assessment of Hal's conduct. In a play that's focused very much on language, the politics of language, the power and perils of language, Warwick actually believes that Hal's time in Eastcheap, learning the low speech of commoners and lawbreakers, is actually preparing him to be a more effective ruler than his father. In fact, this is borne out at the conclusion of the play. And this is what Warwick says. And he's you got to remember, he's speaking to the king here. "The prince but studies his companions like a strange tongue, wherein, to gain the language, 'tis needful that the most immodest word be looked upon and learnt, which once attained, your highness knows comes to no further use but to be known and hated. So, like gross terms, the prince will, in the perfectness of time, cast off his followers, and their memory shall as a pattern or measure live, by which his grace must meet the lives of other, turning past evils to advantages." I think it's a very, very shrewd assessment of Prince Hal, and actually lines up with what happens in this play. And aligns as well with one of the prince's very first speeches in Henry IV, Part 1, where he talks about how he's using his experiences with Falstaff and his Eastcheap friends to prepare himself to become um, an effective ruler later. So Act 4, Scene 3. This is some long speeches here, lines 151 to 352. So this scene, like I said, really long speeches. There's some intriguing father-son tension here. This is the dramatic centerpiece of the play, in my view. The king is lying in bed near death, and the prince enters. He observes his father sleeping and the crown beside him. He comments on the crown as a symbol of the anxiety and mental perturbation that befalls sovereign power. But then he picks it up and he puts it on his own head and exits the stage. His father wakes up and discovers the crown missing, and he makes a conclusion that, based on his previous observations and judgments of his son's character and fitness, his conclusion seems pretty logical. He says, "For this, the foolish, overcareful fathers have broke their sleep with thoughts, their brains with care, their bones with industry. For this they have engrossed and piled up the cankered heaps of strange achieved gold. For this they have been thoughtful to invest their sons with arts and martial exercises, when, like the bee, tolling from every flower, our thighs packed with wax, our mouths with honey, we bring it to the hive and, like the bees, are murdered for our pains." He uses a lot of imagery of, the king does, of bees in this play, of honey and bees. The prince returns to his father shortly after this, and Henry really lets him have it with both barrels. And he once more predicts that England will soon be ruled by criminals and reprobates because of his son. "For the fifth Harry," he says, from curbed license plucks the muzzle of restraint, and the wild dog shall flesh his tooth on every innocent. Oh, my poor kingdom, sick with civil blows, when that my care could not withhold thy riots, what wilt thou do when riot is thy care? Oh, that will be a wilderness again, peopled with wolves, thy old inhabitants." Hal apologizes and comes up with what in some ways sounds like a perfectly Falstaffian excuse. He says, "I put the crown on my head to try with it as with an enemy that had before my face murdered my father." This sounds like one of the many occasions when Falstaff gets caught in a lie, but uses his nimble verbal wit to wriggle free. The Lord Chief Justice calls this Falstaff's manner of wrenching the true cause the false way. I love that phrase. Hal's speech at the moment he crowns himself. This is what he says. The moment he crowns himself, "My due from thee is this, from his father, is this imperial crown, and the world's whole strength shall not force this lineal honor from me." This does not square nicely with the account that he later gives his father. I'll let you all ponder on that. But even so, I think Shakespeare would have us regard his apology and filial deference in this scene as sincere, which explains also, I think, Warwick's corroborative remarks about observing Hal with the crown on crying in the next room. So his apology, his filial deference, his restored sense of duty, his reconciliation with his father, all of it is entirely consistent with his emergence as a full-fledged king in Act 5. The king's final advice to Hal in this scene about how his death will help to establish the legitimacy of the Lancastrian line is interesting, and it turns out to be a false hope, as his grandson Henry VI will discover when he's betrayed in the Wars of the Roses. But the king's emphasis here in one of his last long speeches is on action rather than words. The importance of distracting the people with what he calls foreign quarrels is another important element of his final speech. And it's one that Henry will eventually act on, as Prince John reveals in the final lines of Act 5. when he's talking about preparations underway to go war on France, and how we'll later have tremendous success waging wars against France. And all that will be told in the sequel on King Henry V. But it's Hal's. It's not his military action. It's his linguistic ability. It's his understanding of language and the role of language and the performative nature of kingship that ultimately secures his legitimacy and popularity at home. Act 5, Scene 2, lines 44 to 132. This is the scene where Prince Harry, now King Henry V, reconciles with the Lord Chief Justice. This is the first public demonstration of Hal's maturity and savviness. And it begins with reconciliation over a previous argument before he was king that had ended with Hal striking the Chief Justice in the head and Hal being arrested and for a time incarcerated. And that incident is reviewed briefly in this scene. And after confirming the Chief Justice's position in his court, Hal announces that he's a new man now. He's different. He has matured. He says, "My father is gone wild into his grave, for in his tomb lie my affections." That is, all of his previous riotous passions have been buried with his father. "And with his spirits, sadly I survive to mock the expectation of the world, to frustrate prophecies, and to raise out rotten opinion, who hath writ me down after my seeming. The tide of blood in me hath proudly flowed in vanity till now. Now doth it turn and ebb back to the sea, where it shall mingle with the state of floods, and flow henceforth in formal majesty." Really powerful speech about his readiness to take on the role of monarch. So the last group of scenes that we'll talk about concern Falstaff. And we will start with Act 1, Scene 2, about 100 lines, 125 to 227. This is Falstaff's bantering with the Lord Chief Justice. It's just wonderful wordplay in this back and forth between them. Falstaff, the Lord of Disorder, physical disorder and social disorder, and the senior representative of the English rule of law talking to each other. Their conversation ranges from Falstaff's criminal past to his relationship with Prince Hal, to old age, and finally to his military duty, which Falstaff, of course, is always ready to shirk. This is the first of several encounters between the two men. The next one occurs in Act 2, the first scene of Act 2, lines 54 to 115. And this is another scene of witty repartee between the two men. But this time it really shows Falstaff in a much uglier light, I think, due to his treatment of Mistress Quickly. The Chief Justice is remarkably precise in identifying Falstaff's verbal nimbleness. And again, as other commentators on Falstaff have noticed, this is a kind of excess of speech that is both complimentary and yet oddly contrary to the physical grotesqueness and inertia of Falstaff. This is what the Chief Justice says. Sir John, I am well acquainted with your manner of wrenching the true cause the false way. It is not a confident brow, nor the throng of words that come with such more than impudent sauciness from you can thrust me from a level consideration. You have, as it appears to me, practiced upon the easy yielding spirit of this woman and made her serve your uses both in purse and in person. Although the Chief Justice here claims immunity from Falstaff's wit and appears ready to compel restitution to Quickly, Gower's arrival at this moment, with news of the king's ailing condition and the growing unrest in the north, in York, this gives Falstaff an out, and justice is sacrificed to the more urgent exigencies of the state. which is what happened in the first part of Henry IV, but only temporarily in this play. So Act 2, Scene 4, lines 200 to 333. This is the last scene with Falstaff and Henry of Monmouth as Prince. At the beginning of the scene, the horror doll Tearsheet asks Falstaff, "When wilt thou leave fighting a days and foining a nights, and begin to patch up thine old body for heaven?" And it is right at this point, right as she asks that question, that Prince Hal enters. He's disguised as a tapster, accompanied by Poins. Falstaff doesn't recognize him or acknowledge him at first. He expresses his annoyance at Tearsheet's question. He says, "Do not speak like a death's head," he tells her. "Do not bid me remember mine end." This is interesting because Falstaff's reckoning will finally come in Act 5 when he encounters Hal again, this time in his role as king, and he's severely rebuked and prescribed a course of moral reform. The rest of this scene follows a pretty familiar pattern. Poins and Prince Hal catch Falstaff shooting off his mouth. He's trash talking his supposed friends, and when their identities, Hal and Poins, are finally discovered, which doesn't take long, Falstaff immediately shifts into damage control, trying to convince them that they misunderstood his comments and that he's really loyal to them. They just misread him in that moment. But this time, it's not so funny, and Hal reproaches Falstaff for his hypocrisy, for what he calls his pure fear and entire cowardice, which leads him to betray his companions when it's convenient for his purposes. It's a really strong rebuke that shows Hal's maturation. And when Peto arrives at the tavern with news that Northumberland and his allies are maneuvering for battle, rather than staging a mock court with Falstaff, which is what happened in the first part of Henry IV, he immediately reprimands himself and departs for the king's palace at Westminster to get ready to go to war. He says, "By heaven, Poins, I feel me much to blame, so idly to profane the precious time. When tempest of commotion, like the south, born with black vapor, doth begin to melt and drop upon our bare unarmed heads. Give me my swords and cloak. Falstaff, good night." And those are his last words to Falstaff as Prince. And the last scene we're going to talk about, Act 5, Scene 5, lines 44 to 70, and then the epilogue that follows after, Falstaff's reckoning and last dance. So in Hal's last speech, which he's now crowned King Henry V, he rejects Falstaff. He calls him the tutor and feeder of my riots. And he tells him, "I have turned away my former self, so will I those that kept me company." And at the end of the scene, Falstaff is sent to prison and will ultimately be banished from the city of London, that's a pretty significant punishment for Falstaff, because London, that's his native element, that's his world. And for him to leave it is a kind of social death. And he says, if you come back here, you're going to hang. As for the epilogue, the very last speech in the play, it's a solo speech addressed directly to the theater audience. Many scholars believe that there are clues, specifically the promise of a dance to entertain the audience, that indicate that the speaker of the epilogue was Will Kemp, who was a famous comedic actor known for his physical humor and dancing skills. He's actually listed on the list of players in the 1623 folio, even though he left the Chamberlain's Men in 1599. Scholars also believe that it was Kemp who originally played the part of Falstaff, which, if true, would mean that Falstaff, in a sense, gets the last word, or at least he got the last word in the first performances of this play. And this would in part explain, I think, the reference to Oldcastle, which was Falstaff's original character name in line 28. I'm not going to get back into that here. For more on the Oldcastle issue, you can see my video on Henry IV, Part 1. But finally, the epilogue also suggests that Falstaff's antics would resume in Henry V, a direct sequel to this play. Falstaff would later appear as the main character in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor. This was a comedy in which Falstaff attempts to seduce two married women who sort of figure out the game he's playing and conspire to humiliate him quite successfully. But Falstaff never appears on stage in King Henry V. In that play, Mistress quickly instead offers a brief but really touching account of his final moments on his deathbed. And if you're curious, this is Act 2, Scene 3, again, of Henry V. And other familiar Eastcheap figures like Pistol and Bardolph remark on his loss. There's a boy who's with him, and he recalls this time that Falstaff, I'm going to quote him here, saw a flea stick upon Bardolph's nose, and is said it was a black soul burning in hellfire. I like that. This is an engraving of Henry Fuseli's delightful painting of Falstaff and Doll Tearsheet. I believe this is the moment that she serves as Falstaff's death's head, asking him, "When wilt thou leave fighting a days and foining a nights, and begin to patch up thine old body for heaven?" And that concludes this lecture on Henry IV, Part 2.